Do origins matter? What about the origins of what we believe? Do you not agree it is important to know where our beliefs come from, in order to ascertain whether these beliefs have any merit? The interpretation of the 7 times of Daniel chapter 4 as a period of 2,520 years comes from a man named John Aquila Brown, who first published the idea in 1823. He began the starting point of the 7 times in 604 BC, the first regnal year of Nebuchadnezzar, and ended the 7 times in 1917. The end of the 7 times was said to be when the full glory of Israel shall be perfected. This interpretation of the 7 times would soon be picked up by dozens of others, each with their own starting and ending points of the 2,520 years. In 1844, E.B. Elliott was the first to come up with the possibility that this period would end in 1914. William Miller, the father of the Adventist movement, believed the 2,520 years would end in 1843. Based on other calculations, he believed Christ would return in 1843. Then when that failed, 1844. The failed prediction of 1844 was called the Great Disappointment. The Adventist movement splintered into dozens of smaller groups. Some of these groups who survive to this day still believe that 1844 is a marked date in Bible prophecy. As an aside, it is very interesting the similarities of these groups that descended from William Miller, even those who disavow him as a theological forebearer. Adventist groups have a history of making predictions and calculations, and sometimes when these fail, such as 1844, they often say they expected the wrong thing at the right time. When circumstances such as failed predictions force them to change their teachings, they speak of new light and present truth. Some of these who were in the Adventist movement were George Storrs, Jonas Wendell, and most importantly for the purposes of our discussion, N.H. Barber. Barber believed, based on his calculations, that Christ would return in 1873, then when that failed, 1874. Much like Miller's prediction, it was seen as expecting the wrong thing at the right time. Barber began to teach that Christ had indeed come in that year, and that 1874 was the start of Christ's invisible presence. In 1875, Barber taught that the Gentile times started with the destruction of Jerusalem, which he dated to 606 BC, and that the Gentile times would end in 1914. Of course, as we previously seen, Jerusalem was destroyed in 587 BC. So where did the year 606 BC come from? Because he believed that 536 BC was the first year of Cyrus, and that this ended the 70 years, it was a simple calculation of subtracting 70 years from 536 BC and deriving 606 BC. Of course, today most acknowledge that the first year of Cyrus was 538 BC, not 536 BC. Another problem with his calculation is that he failed to account for the simple fact that there was no 0 year. It was important for him to stress a 40-year period spanning from 1874 to 1914. He made other predictions, none of which materialized. But when these also failed, some of his followers later attributed other meanings to these dates. For instance, 1878, which was expected to be a time of rapture, was changed to be when the heavenly resurrection began. 1914 was taught to be when God's kingdom would fully rule the earth, when earthly Jerusalem would no longer be trampled by the Gentiles. In fact, it would be when all Gentile rule would end, and when the body of Christ would be glorified. It wasn't expected to be the beginning of a time of troubles, but the end. All of this was confirmed by measurements of the Great Pyramid, which was regarded as the Bible in stone. Of all the many predictions that were made for 1914, not one came true. Like in 1844 and 1874, it was decided that they had expected the wrong thing at the right time. There was new light or revisioning of the chronologies. The invisible presence of Christ was moved from 1874 to 1914. The heavenly resurrection was moved from 1878 to 1918. By the 1940s, it was realized that the first year of Cyrus was 538 BC, not 536. However, the end of the 70 years was said to now have occurred in 537 BC, the date set for the return of the exiles to Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem was moved from 606 BC to 607. It was also acknowledged by this time that there was no 0 year. Through all this, 1914 and the Gentile Times calculation was retained. In the meantime, scores of other predictions were made, such as the resurrection of the ancient worthies in 1925 that would fight the War of Armageddon. But none of these predictions came to pass. In regard to 1914, some object, but something happened in 1914. Even though the expectations were wrong, the very fact that they pointed to that year, that's phenomenal. It is true that in 1914, something happened. In August of that year, World War I did break out. But it should be pointed out that this occurred months before October of 1914, when the Gentile Times were said to end. It should be understood that there were dozens of groups that made over 3 dozen predictions as to the end point of the 7 times. For instance, there were calculations made by different Adventist groups who predicted the Gentile Times would end in 1900, 1915, 17, 18, 19, 1922. Where are many of these groups today? Many are long forgotten. It just so happens that one of these Adventist offshoots calculated 1914, and something occurred in that year, just not anything that was predicted. Those who have championed these predictions have and do regard themselves as God's mouthpiece, or a sole channel of communication with mankind, giving food at the proper time. But when keeping in mind how history has repeated itself, with failed predictions, and the many errors made along the way, the credentials of such ones have to come into question. In regard to such credentials, Deuteronomy 18 warns, "You may be privately wondering, how are we to tell a prophecy does not come from Yahweh? When a prophet speaks in the name of Yahweh, and the thing does not happen, and the word is not fulfilled, then it has not been said by Yahweh. The prophet has spoken presumptuously. You have nothing to fear from him." Some might say, "Oh, they never claimed to be inspired prophets." However, when it is said that our spiritual health and our relationship with God depend on this channel, is that not claiming a prophetic role? What is a prophet if not God's mouthpiece, his channel of communication with mankind? In regard to 1914, 1925, 1975, and other predictions, were these thoughts that came from God, food at the proper time, spoken faithfully and discreetly, or were they spoken presumptuously? If they were spoken presumptuously, what does Deuteronomy advise us in regard to their credentials?